What's up, everyone? I just wanted to give you a quick heads up that this video is going to be a little bit different than the format we usually use. There were several things that kind of came together, the mic issues that we've been having, the various disparate elements that we wanted to include in one video. Just all these things put together made us realize it makes more sense to do a sort of montage, and then I'm doing a narration over the top. So I hope you enjoy this video. I hope it still has some useful tidbits for you, and I've got some more information at the end of the video. So here are some of the issues that I was having when trying to scrape the binding for the body. There was a huge issue with the lacquer that I had put on underneath the paint, and that it was significantly harder than the paint that was on top. And so, as you could probably tell from the video, I was having to really push and scrape to try and get that lacquer to come up. And in addition to being difficult to get off, it also did not scrape cleanly the way that paint or binding does. It was actually chipping out because it's a harder surface. And because of that, those chip outs were reaching clear into the paint that was over the body itself. So scraping the binding with this configuration was definitely not good. It did not turn out well. I was not at all happy with the results. And as time went on, the problem with the cracking and the chipping got worse on the binding itself. I had pieces come out. I had, big chunks just fall off that I had to go back in and try and refill with binding melted in acetone. And it just became a constant cycle of, chasing my own tail, trying to get to a point where I had something decent. And at some point along in this process, I realized that this wasn't going to work. It just wasn't going to work out. And at that point, I decided I needed to go ahead and run a test and see if I could remove the binding using the router jig that I originally used to route the channel for the binding. So I went ahead and I ran that test, got set up. It went really smooth. It wasn't too difficult at all. It was pretty much just like routing anything else. The router went right through it and didn't seem to have any problems or weird issues. And then, as you can see there, it did a pretty good job. There was a tiny bit of plastic still adhered to the body because the router bit was pushed away from the body, the thickness of the paint and clear coat that I had on there. So later on, you'll see that on the body itself, I had to come back through with a chisel and sandpaper and files in order to get that channel nice and clean. So yeah, the whole process went pretty well. I had to be careful around the neck pocket. As you can see, there's some pretty big chunks of plastic that come flying off this thing as I tear into it and relieve stress. The router may have been throwing those off. But I suspect that in many of those cases they were well, I know they were. I know that many of those pieces had pre-existing vertical cracks in them. It was not a homogeneous piece of binding anymore. It had just cracked all over the place. So this was a very difficult decision to reach. I spent at least a week, going back and forth whether this was really necessary. But once I got to this stage and I started doing it, I immediately felt a sense of relief. And, it sounds kind of corny or whatever, but that kind of let me know that I was on the right path. That I was, had called it for what it was. It wasn't going to work, and I needed to just take care of it, get it all out of there, and put some good, clean, fresh binding in there so it could look its best. The chiseling went really well. Just pretty straightforward. For the most part, I only had to chisel on the wider part of the binding. There was an occasional piece here or there where I had to chisel the narrower ledge. but it went pretty quick. And then in certain places, like deep in curves and stuff, I had to resort to files and sandpaper in order to get that out. And I went over the whole thing at the end with a block with some 320 grit sandpaper on it, just to kind of make sure everything was even. I did need to be extra sure I wasn't taking out material. It was very important that I removed only the extra binding and didn't deepen the channel, because that would cause problems for the new binding that I was about to put in. So this is the basic bolt hole design I'm going for. When I ripped out the binding, I realized that I needed to go ahead and redo the bolt holes as well, because it was bothering me because they weren't right. So I went for sort of a trapezoidal shape, and I did decide to keep that one hole on the corner. It was already basically in the perfect spot right where I wanted it. And here you can see that the next hole would come in to kind of tighten the top down, and then this one would come in a little less but down a lot further, and then this one would come out and down, and that would give me the sort of trapezoidal pattern that I wanted. Drilling was pretty straightforward. Just made sure I was lined up properly, and just drilled them out with a drill bit that was the same diameter as the swamp ash dowel rod that I'll use here in a minute. So when doing these, I made sure to put wood glue through the hole. This is partly just to act as a lubrication, to make it a little easier to get them in. I also took sandpaper on the hard edges of the pieces of dowel rod I have there, which helps to ensure that it gets started and goes in there really well. It slides in with very little problem, but it's also very tight. Immediately the woods kind of start to soak up that wood glue, and it doesn't budge. Once it's in there, it's not going anywhere. I did have to do a little bit of adjusting here and there with hammer, as is to be expected. Okay, so here I'm using I bought it as a Japanese fret saw, but I have found many, many uses for this saw. Anytime I need to cut very close to a surface in an accurate way. So I'm taking my time, working a groove into it before I start to really saw into these pieces. Once I have these cut flush, I then took it over to the overhead router and went ahead and took just the tiniest bit off the top of this neck pocket to make sure that everything was perfectly level within the pocket, and that it wouldn't cause any problems. It did take a little bit. I didn't have a lot of throw there, so I had to work it back and forth, little at a time, till I got through all three of them. Once I got that done, I was ready to go ahead and start working on the binding. I took some of the ideas that the community provided, which I very much appreciate, and I started to apply the binding from the middle at the bottom of the guitar and wrap it around while I'm doing the taping step. Also included in this is my fabulous tape caddy. Just a little 5-minute diversion, just to do something and let my mind work on some of the problems I was working through here. Okay, so yeah, other than this, it's pretty straightforward. I go around. I make sure not to apply too much heat this time around, only in the places where it's absolutely necessary, which is mainly just around the horn. Other than that, I start from the middle. I tape all the way around the outside edge of the body, and once I have that done and the binding trimmed, then I go ahead and start the gluing process. So here you can see the gluing process I'm doing on the back side of the body, which I've already got taped up. At the ends of the binding, I try to make sure to apply super glue and hold it manually, put some pressure on it so that those bits are stuck exceptionally well. Other than that, it's a pretty straightforward process, like you've seen just about anywhere. put the super glue on, tape it back up, and let it set. I am using StewMac medium super glue with a wick tip, which makes application much easier. I do think that ultimately acetone is a superior method. However, using acetone in this situation with the paint and the clear coat that was still there would have resulted in quite a mess. So super glue was the right tool for this situation, I think. And once the binding was on and dried, it was time to paint again. In this case, I am using the same paint. I've been very happy with this paint. I think it's absolutely excellent stuff. Sherwin-Williams Dimension paint. Goes on easy, levels well, sands really well. Really good stuff. I'm definitely satisfied with that. Um, so just same process as before. I put on several coats of paint. I end up going 3 coats. You'll notice in spots here where the paint meets the wood, there's no lip there. I made sure to sand very carefully so that nowhere on the body was there any lip that could be felt with a fingertip. It was all smooth transitions everywhere, so once the new coat of paint was on, it just looking good. So another little diversion I had was building this benchtop guitar holder using the that uses the same pipe that I use in my spray booth. This was very helpful, very useful. Um, Allowed me to work with the piece on the bench top without setting it down in everything that was coming off the guitar. This is especially helpful when scraping binding because those paint scrapings will glue themselves back into the paint that is on the body very easily. And then you end up having to sand that out, and it's just a pain and increases time and complexity of the job. Um, so doing it that way, I was able to get that done really quickly. Unfortunately, I do not have video of that binding being scraped. I looked through all my videos. I think possibly the camera was full and I didn't realize it, or I just didn't get it turned on. Um, I know a lot of people would like to see that binding scraping process in full. I do have another guitar that has binding on it. At some point, I will work that guitar over, and at that point, I'll make a short video just solely focused on binding and scraping and the tools that I use to get that done, to get some good clean lines. At this point, we move on to the neck. It's a similar process here in that we drilled out the holes and we're just using links of maple dowel rod and some super glue, and some wood glue to lubricate and set them once they're in. Um, and then I use a hammer to kind of help them along. And once that is done, then I will come back with the same flat fret saw and saw these flat. Uh, Now, one thing that I don't show here is that I did have some additional difficulties with this process. Um, once, and as an aside, I used sandpaper, not the router, in order to get this flat because I didn't want to take even a little bit off the top of this neck heel. It was important to keep it exactly the same and only sand down the top of the dowel rods. So these 4 dowel rods went great. Then I drilled 4 new holes. However, unfortunately, those holes were not marked in the exact right positions, despite the fact that I'd put the neck on the body and then used a brad point drill bit to mark those holes. So what I ended up having to do was drill those out and adjust the hole slightly and drill new ones. But this presented an entire new problem in that the new holes, the third set of holes, were only slightly offset from the second set of holes, which means when I went to tap the threads in them, the thread tapper was actually cutting across the grain, which left those pieces with no real strength. So that clearly wasn't going to work. So at that point, I realized that I had no choice but to go ahead and drill the hole out bigger. And instead of using the steel inserts I'd used up to this point, I went ahead and switched to brass inserts. And these brass inserts are good. They have big, wide tines that get a good grip. I did make sure to clamp the heel as I was driving them in because I was not able to tap the threads for them because they have an unusual thread count. So I clamped the heel, ran the brass ones in, and in order to facilitate them going in well, I used paste wax on the threads, and that reduced the friction enough that they were able to run all the way into the wood. So at that point, I've got the brass inserts in there. They're rock solid, really good. They're not the ideal solution. I think the steel ones are better overall and just easier to use. But the brass ones definitely work, and yeah, they look good. Okay, and this is where I ran into a rather large issue. The clear coat that I'd used, Bright Tone Clear Coat, which is an absolutely excellent product, and I've seen used many times in many places. It's really great stuff. However, it was not compatible with the automotive paint that I'd laid down. The Bright Tone is water-based. The automotive paint is not, and they just simply don't bond to one another. So when I had taped up the back of the neck in order to put paint down on the heel after I'd done all that work down there, I found that when I pulled the masking tape up, it just pulled the clear coat up right with it. And as you can see here, as soon as I pull the tape up, it doesn't even have to stay on there for more than a few seconds. I can just pull that tape up and the clear comes right up with it. And in fact, I then proceeded off camera to strip the entire neck of all clear coat using nothing but masking tape in about 5 to 10 minutes. Took no time at all. Yeah, it just comes right off. So these products are just simply incompatible. I had a decent layer on there. Yeah, they just simply don't work together.
All right. Thanks for sticking around to the end. Just wanted to give you a quick right now update as to where we're at. I've been experimenting with some of these two-part finishes. I've been doing some test pieces. I've got a neck I did a couple years ago. It was my first test neck, actually. And I'm still doing more tests with it. But I'm really liking the results. This is hard, tough stuff. And in the place where I did manage to gouge it out, the paint stuck to the clear. So that's a really good sign. Obviously, this clear coat is specifically tested to work with the Dimension paint since they're both sold by Sherwin-Williams Automotive. So yeah, I've been really happy with the results so far. Pretty soon I should be able to go ahead and get clear coat on the body and neck, and we can move on to buffing and assembly. So I'm really excited about that. I still have high hopes for my vision for this guitar. I think it's going to be kind of interesting and a little bit showy, but also classy at the same time, like showy and subtle. And it's just the intersection of a lot of different things. I think it's going to look nice. I'm not happy with every choice I've made, but overall I'm happy with the direction that I've taken it and the places where I've gone back and corrected things that I wasn't happy with. And I think that's important. So yeah, really appreciate you guys sticking around. Please hit like and subscribe, share it. You can find me on Instagram at WebsterER. And we will see you in the next video.